On the morning of Friday, June 19, 1942, a disheveled man in a rumpled suit walked into the lobby of FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. He carried a worn leather briefcase and spoke with a German accent. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. His hands trembled slightly as he approached the reception desk. He had been trying to reach the bureau for 5 days. 5 days of unanswered calls, dismissed warnings, and mounting desperation. First, he had telephoned the FBI's New York field office. The agent who answered sent the call to what they internally called the nut desk, the post for fielding calls from cranks, conspiracy theorists, and lunatics. "Yesterday," Napoleon called, the agent quipped before hanging up. The caller had identified himself as Franz Daniel Pastorius. He claimed to have arrived from Germany by submarine with information about a Nazi sabotage operation. The agent filed a brief memo noting the call. Then he forgot about it entirely. Now this same man stood in the marble lobby of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world, demanding to speak with someone in charge. The agents gave him blank expressions and patronizing nods. They shuffled him from office to office. Nobody wanted to deal with another eccentric claiming inside knowledge of enemy operations. The war had produced thousands of such callers, each convinced they alone could expose German plots that existed only in their imaginations. Finally, exasperated beyond patience, the man tore open his briefcase and dumped its contents onto the desk. Stacks of $50 bills cascaded across the polished surface and spilled onto the floor. The agents stared in disbelief. $82,550 in American currency lay scattered before them. More money than most of them would earn in a decade. The second agent slowly picked up one of the bills, examined it carefully, and asked the question that would change everything. Is this stuff real? His name was John Dasch. He was the leader of a team of Nazi saboteurs who had landed by submarine on a Long Island beach 6 days earlier, carrying enough explosives to wage a 2-year campaign of destruction against American industry. He had come to turn himself in. He had come to betray the mission he had been sent to carry out. And for 5 days, despite his repeated attempts to surrender, nobody in the Federal Bureau of Investigation would listen. This is the story of Operation Pastorius. 8 Nazi saboteurs trained in the dark arts of destruction, a chance encounter on a foggy beach that should have stopped them cold. A bureaucracy so confident in its own competence that it almost let disaster slip through its fingers. And a legal reckoning so swift and so secret that its constitutional echoes still reverberate through American law more than 80 years later. The origins of Operation Pastorius trace back to a humiliation that enraged Adolf Hitler. In September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, the FBI arrested 33 members of the Duquesne spy ring in the largest espionage case in American history. Every German intelligence asset in the United States was rolled up in a single devastating operation. The network that the Abwehr, German military intelligence, had spent years cultivating was destroyed overnight. Hitler was furious. The Führer demanded immediate action. After Pearl Harbor and Germany's subsequent declaration of war on December 11, 1941, his rage found a specific target. Germany could not bomb American factories from across the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe lacked the range. But Germany could infiltrate agents trained in sabotage to destroy those factories from within. If the Abwehr could not spy on America, then it would burn America instead. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, assigned the mission to Lieutenant Walter Kappe. The choice was logical. Kappe was a 37-year-old former press secretary for the German-American Bund, who had lived in the United States for 12 years before returning to Germany in 1937. He knew American culture, American geography, and American vulnerabilities. More importantly, he had access to the Ausland Institute, a government office that tracked Germans who had returned from living abroad. From their extensive records, Kappe began identifying potential recruits. He searched for men who spoke fluent English, understood American customs, and possessed technical skills useful for sabotage. The selection process was neither careful nor thorough. Kappe initially recruited 12 candidates based primarily on their American experience. 4 dropped out during training, some from fear and others from lack of aptitude. The remaining 8 were divided into 2 teams of 4. Their mission was codenamed Operation Pastorius, after Francis Daniel Pastorius, who led the first organized German settlement in America at Germantown, Pennsylvania, in 1683. The historical reference was deliberate. These men were descendants of German emigrants. They were returning to a land their ancestors had helped build, and they were coming back to tear it apart. The strategic targets were ambitious in scope. Aluminum plants critical to aircraft production in Alcoa, Tennessee, East St. Louis, Illinois, and Massena, New York. A cryolite plant in Philadelphia essential for aluminum processing. Hydroelectric facilities that powered American industry. The Hell Gate Bridge in New York City, which carried 4 vital rail lines across the East River. The Horseshoe Curve, near Altoona, Pennsylvania, a critical choke point on the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line where trains had to slow to navigate the sharp bend. Canal locks along the Ohio River connecting the industrial heartland. Newark Penn Station, a major rail hub. Jewish-owned department stores to spread terror among civilian populations. The campaign was designed to last 2 years, with additional sabotage teams dispatched every 6 weeks to replenish operatives and maintain the pressure. If successful, Operation Pastorius would cripple America's ability to wage war. In April 1942, the 8 recruits gathered at Quirin's farm, a sabotage training school near Brandenburg an der Havel, roughly 40 miles west of Berlin. The estate was unremarkable from the outside, designed to attract no attention. It had a main house, a greenhouse, a gymnasium, 2 shooting ranges, and a 2-room garage that had been converted into a classroom and explosives laboratory. The property was isolated, surrounded by woods, and guarded by men who asked no questions about what happened inside. For approximately 3 weeks, the recruits trained in the manufacture and deployment of explosives. They learned to construct bombs from commercially available materials that could be purchased at any American hardware store. They studied incendiaries, primers, and timing devices, both mechanical and chemical. They memorized methods for destroying railroad lines, collapsing bridges, and bringing down high-tension electrical infrastructure. They examined maps and photographs of American industrial facilities until they could sketch the layouts from memory. All notes were destroyed each evening. Nothing was written down that could be captured if the mission failed. A chilling protocol governed the training. The instructors made clear that if any saboteur showed signs of wavering, if any man expressed doubt or hesitation about completing the mission, the others were to kill him without compunction. There would be no turning back. There would be no second thoughts. Any man who lost his nerve became a liability to be eliminated. After completing their instruction, the men received 10 days' leave to say goodbye to their families. They were not told to expect death. They were told to prepare for a 2-year absence. Then they returned to Quirin's farm for final preparations. They received approximately $175,200 in American currency, divided between the 2 teams. They were issued counterfeit documents, including birth certificates, social security cards, draft deferment cards, and driver's licenses. Everything they needed to disappear into American society. The 2 teams were given a rendezvous date and location. July 4, 1942, at the Hotel Gibson in Cincinnati. Capet reportedly chose Independence Day as a sardonic joke. The day Americans celebrated their freedom would mark the beginning of their terror. The 8 saboteurs came from remarkably similar backgrounds, yet their motivations could not have been more different. All were born in Germany. All had lived in America for extended periods, spoke English fluently, and had returned to the fatherland in the years before the war. Most were blue-collar tradesmen, machinists and toolmakers and factory workers, whose knowledge of American industrial facilities made them valuable. Their ages ranged from 22 to 39. With the exception of their leader, all were members of the German-American Bund, the Nazi Party, or both. 2 of them, Ernest Berger and Herbert Haupt, held American citizenship. But loyalty cannot be assumed from party membership, and hatred cannot be measured by official records. 2 of these men had already decided to betray the mission before they ever left German soil. George John Dasch was the oldest saboteur at 39, and by far the most complicated figure in the operation. Born in Speyer, Germany on February 7, 1903, he entered the United States illegally as a stowaway in 1922. He spent nearly 2 decades in America, drifting from job to job across the country. He worked as a waiter, a fry cook, and a caterer in Philadelphia, Honolulu, Chicago, and New York. In 1927, he enlisted in the United States Army, served honorably in the Aviation Corps, and received an honorable discharge. He married an American woman named Rose Marie Giel. America was his home. He considered himself American despite his German birth, despite his accent, despite the passport he carried. Dasch returned to Germany around 1939 at his elderly mother's urging. He found work as a radio monitor, listening to foreign broadcasts and translating them for German authorities. It was dull, safe work, far from the front lines. When Walter Kappe recruited him for Operation Pastorius, Dasch saw an opportunity the Abwehr did not anticipate. He saw a way back to America, a submarine ticket home. Whether he truly intended to carry out the mission or planned to betray it from the start remains debated by historians. What is certain is that Dasch never considered himself a Nazi agent. He considered himself an American trapped in Germany, finally given a means of escape. Ernest Peter Berger was perhaps the most unexpected recruit of all, a former true believer whose faith had been tortured out of him. Born on September 1, 1906 in Augsburg, Berger joined the Freikorps paramilitary at age 15, drawn to its vision of German renewal. He joined the Nazi Party at 17, one of the earliest members. In November 1923, he participated in the Beer Hall Putsch, alongside Hitler himself, marching through the streets of Munich in what the Nazis would later mythologize as the founding act of their movement. Berger, immigrated to America in 1927, worked as a tool and die maker in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois, and became a naturalized American citizen in 1933. But the Depression drove him back to Germany, where his early party membership earned him a position as aide to Ernst Röhm, chief of the SA Brownshirts. It was a dangerous place to stand in 1934. When the SS purged the SA leadership in the Night of the Long Knives, Berger was caught in the crossfire. The Gestapo arrested him on fabricated charges. He spent 17 months in a concentration camp. His wife suffered a miscarriage from the stress and descended into mental breakdown from the ongoing Nazi harassment of their family. Fellow saboteur Herbert Haupt later testified that Berger hated the Gestapo more than anything on earth. When the Abwehr recruited Berger for Operation Pastorius, trading on his American citizenship and knowledge of the country, he agreed without hesitation. But his loyalty to the Reich had died in that concentration camp. He joined the mission for one purpose: escape and revenge. The other 6 men were true believers, or at least appeared to be. Heinrich Harm Heinck, born in Hamburg in 1907, had jumped ship in New York in 1926 and worked as a machinist until 1939. Richard Quirin, born in Berlin in 1908, had spent 3 years at General Electric in Schenectady before the Depression cost him his job. Both men had worked together at the Volkswagen factory after returning to Germany. They were the first 2 recruits Kappe approached. Edward John Curling, born in 1909, had studied engineering at the University of Freiburg, joined the Nazi Party in 1928, and worked as a chauffeur for prominent Americans before sailing back to Germany in 1940. Herbert Hans Haupt was the youngest at 22, born in Stettin in 1919. He had become an American citizen in 1930 through his parents' naturalization when he was just a boy. He attended Lane Technical High School in Chicago and worked as an apprentice optician. He left America in 1941 on what was meant to be a worldwide adventure and ended up in Germany after helping a ship run the British blockade. He received an Iron Cross Second Class for his service. He insisted throughout his brief trial that he joined Pastorius only as a way to return to Chicago. Hermann Otto Neubauer, born in Hamburg in 1910, had trained as a cook and worked at hotels in Hartford and Chicago. He served in the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front and was wounded in combat before being recruited while convalescing. Werner Thiel, born in Essen in 1907, had worked at the Ford Motor Company in Detroit before drifting through jobs across America during the Depression. They were an imperfect team assembled for an impossible mission. Some were fanatics, some were opportunists, some were broken men looking for escape. And, unknown to the Abwehr, at least 2 had already decided to betray the operation before they ever left German soil. On May 28, 1942, the first team departed the German submarine base at Lorient, France, aboard U-202, a Type 7C submarine commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Hans-Heinz Linder. George Dasch led this group of 4. With him were Ernest Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin. The second team had departed 2 days earlier aboard U-584, commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Joachim Decke, headed for the Florida coast. Each submarine carried 4 heavy wooden crates sealed in wax to protect them from moisture, containing enough explosives, detonators, incendiaries, and timing devices to sustain the 2-year sabotage campaign. The Atlantic crossing took approximately 2 weeks. Conditions aboard the submarine were cramped, fetid, and terrifying. The saboteurs were not submariners. They had never experienced the claustrophobic reality of life beneath the waves. The recycled air grew thick and foul. Condensation dripped constantly from every surface. The smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and bilge water permeated everything. When depth charges from Allied patrol aircraft exploded nearby, the hull groaned, and the men wondered if each moment would be their last. Dasch spent much of the voyage in his bunk, feigning seasickness while wrestling with what he intended to do. He had resolved to betray the mission. But the execution required planning. When should he act? How could he contact American authorities without being killed by his fellow saboteurs? And could he trust any of them? At approximately 12:10 in the morning on Saturday, June 13, 1942, U-202 surfaced off the coast of Long Island. Heavy fog blanketed the shore, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The submarine's captain could hear the surf but could barely see the beach. He ordered the 4 men to inflate their rubber raft and prepare to disembark. They wore German Navy uniforms, a deliberate choice mandated by Kappe. If captured during the landing, their uniforms would qualify them as prisoners of war under international law, rather than spies subject to execution. Once ashore, they would bury the uniforms and change into civilian clothes. The raft scraped onto Atlantic Avenue Beach near Amagansett, a small community roughly 100 miles east of Manhattan on Long Island's South Fork. The fog was so thick that visibility extended perhaps 50 feet. The 4 men began unloading the crates, digging holes in the sand to bury their equipment, their German uniforms, and the supplies they could not carry. They worked quickly, anxiously, knowing that every moment on the exposed beach increased their danger. They had perhaps 20 minutes of relative peace. Then disaster found them in the most unlikely form imaginable. John Cornelius Cullen was 21 years old, a seaman recruit in the United States Coast Guard, stationed at the Amagansett lifeboat station barely 300 yards from where the saboteurs were digging. He was what they called a sand pounder, one of the hundreds of Coast Guardsmen assigned to walk the beaches at night, watching for exactly this kind of enemy activity. But Cullen carried no rifle. His only equipment was a flashlight and a flare gun. He was conducting a routine patrol, trudging through sand he had walked hundreds of times before, when he spotted a figure emerging from the fog. "Who are you?" Cullen called out. His voice sounded thin in the heavy air. Dasch approached, his German uniform still damp from the spray. 2 more figures stood visible behind him, knee-deep in the surf. Dasch spoke quickly, his mind racing for a plausible explanation. He claimed they were fishermen from Southampton whose boat had run aground on a sandbar. They were waiting for the tide to lift it free. Cullen was suspicious. The explanation made no sense. These men were not dressed like fishermen. Their accents were not local. Why would they be standing in the surf in the middle of the night? He suggested they come back to the Coast Guard station to wait. The invitation was both hospitality and test. Dasch refused. His tone shifted, becoming harder, more threatening. "Wait a minute," he said quietly. "You don't know what's going on. How old are you? Have you a father and mother? I wouldn't want to kill you." At that moment, a 4th man waded from the surf, dragging a heavy canvas bag. He called out to the others in German, apparently unaware that an American Coast Guardsman stood just yards away. Dasch spun around and cursed at him viciously. When Cullen asked what was in the bag, Dasch answered without hesitation, "Clams." But Cullen was a Long Island native. He knew there were no clams in this stretch of beach. The story was collapsing, and both men knew it. Dasch reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills. He offered Cullen $100 to forget the encounter, to turn around, walk away, and pretend he had seen nothing. Cullen refused. Dasch produced more money. "Then take 300. Cullen hesitated. He was unarmed, outnumbered 4-1, and standing in fog so thick that no one at the station could see or hear what was happening. He made the calculation that would save his life. He accepted the money, calculating that compliance was his best chance of walking away. Dasch stepped closer until his face was inches from Cullen's. "Now look me in the eyes," he commanded. "Would you recognize me if you saw me again?" Cullen lied smoothly, meeting the man's gaze. "No," he said. "I never saw you. I don't know you." Then he backed slowly into the fog, turned, and ran for the station as fast as his legs could carry him. The money Cullen clutched turned out to be $260. Dasch had shortchanged him even in bribery. Boatswain's mate Carl Jeanette armed the men with .30 caliber rifles and led a patrol back to the beach. But the saboteurs had vanished into the fog, moving faster than the Coast Guardsmen could follow. At daybreak, the search party returned and began digging. They found the 4 buried crates. When they pried open the wax-sealed lids, they found enough explosives, detonators, and timing devices to level factories. German Navy uniforms lay crumpled in a nearby hole, cigarettes bearing German brands, equipment marked with German military designations. The sound of diesel engines echoed faintly across the water. U-202, which had run aground on a sandbar during the landing operation, had finally freed itself with the rising tide. Linder had been forced to wait until dawn, his submarine vulnerable to patrol aircraft, before he could slip beneath the waves and begin the long journey home. The FBI was notified by midday on June 13th, but by then, George Dasch and his 3 companions had already walked to the Amagansett train station, purchased tickets for cash, boarded the Long Island Railroad, and disappeared into Manhattan. They checked into separate hotels using their false identities. They had arrived in America. The mission had begun, and George Dasch had already decided it would never be completed. 4 days later, and 500 miles to the south, the second team came ashore. In the early morning hours of June 17th, 1942, Edward Curling led his group of 4 onto Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, roughly 20 miles south of Jacksonville. Unlike the chaotic Long Island landing, this operation proceeded without incident. No Coast Guard patrols interrupted them. No witnesses observed their arrival. The 4 men, wearing swimming suits and German Navy caps, paddled their rubber raft through light surf and dragged it onto the sand. They buried their 4 crates of explosives in the dunes near the ruins of an abandoned house, approximately 4 miles south of the Ponte Vedra Inn. The burial site was unremarkable, indistinguishable from countless similar stretches of Florida coastline. Then they walked north along the beach, splashing in the surf like tourists enjoying an early morning swim. They reached Highway A, 1A, stopped at a small general store that also served as the local post office, and caught a Greyhound bus to Jacksonville without attracting the slightest suspicion. In Jacksonville, the team split up according to plan. Curling and Werner Thiel boarded a train heading north toward Cincinnati and eventually New York City. Hermann Neubauer and Herbert Haupt traveled northwest toward Chicago, where Haupt had family and contacts from his previous American life. 8 Nazi saboteurs were now loose in the United States. They carried enough money to operate for years. They had memorized their targets and timetables. The FBI knew something had happened on Long Island, but had no idea who had landed, how many there were, or where they had gone. The investigation had recovered explosives and uniforms, but no suspects. In a hotel room in Manhattan, George Dasch was preparing to make the decision that would determine whether any of them lived or died. On the evening of June 14th, 1942, in their room at the Governor Clinton Hotel on 7th Avenue in Manhattan, George Dasch confronted Ernest Berger. The 2 men had barely spoken privately since landing. Now Dasch closed the door, walked to the window, and opened it wide. The city noise rose from the street below, masking their conversation from any ears that might be listening. "You and I are going to have a talk," Dasch said quietly. "And if we disagree, only one of us will walk out that door. The other will fly out this window." Berger did not hesitate. He smiled and agreed immediately. His 17 months in a Nazi concentration camp had guaranteed his loyalty lay elsewhere. The Gestapo had beaten any love for Germany out of him. Both men, it turned out, had joined Operation Pastorius for the same reason: escape. Neither had any intention of destroying American factories. That same evening, Dasch telephoned the FBI's New York field office. He identified himself as Franz Daniel Pastorius, the code name for the operation, and claimed he had vital information about a Nazi submarine landing on American soil. Agent Dean McWhorter took the call. His response was dismissive, almost mocking. "Yesterday Napoleon called," he quipped. The previous day it had been Hitler himself on the line. The nut desk fielded dozens of such calls every week. McWhorter filed a brief memo noting the contact and forgot about it. Dasch was stricken with panic. During training at Quen's farm, he had been warned that the FBI might be infiltrated by German agents. Was this a test? Had he just exposed himself to Nazi operatives inside American intelligence who would now arrange his elimination? He paced his hotel room through the night, weighing his options. He could abandon the surrender attempt and simply disappear into America with his share of the money. He could try another approach to the authorities. Or he could complete the sabotage mission he had been sent to carry out. He pressed forward. After spending a day and a half in a marathon card game with old waiter friends from his previous American life, an apparent attempt to calm his shattered nerves and establish an alibi, Dasch boarded a train to Washington on June 18th. He checked into room 351 at the Mayflower Hotel, one of the capital's most prestigious addresses, just blocks from FBI headquarters. On Friday morning, June 19th, Dasch telephoned FBI headquarters. He again identified himself as Pastorius, referenced his earlier ignored call to New York, and demanded to speak with someone who would take him seriously. This time the call reached Agent Dwayne Traynor, who supervised the Bureau's sabotage investigations. Traynor was skeptical, weary of cranks, but curious. The Coast Guard had already reported the Amagansett landing. Physical evidence had been recovered. If this caller was connected to that incident, ignoring him could prove catastrophic. A car was dispatched to the Mayflower to bring Dasch in. What followed was one of the most remarkable confessions in FBI history. After being bounced between skeptical agents, after dumping $82,000 onto an agent's desk just to prove he was serious, George Dasch began talking. He talked for 8 consecutive days. Stenographers worked in relays, typing continuously as the torrent of information poured forth. The final confession filled 254 single-spaced pages. Dasch provided the identities, aliases, and physical descriptions of all 7 of his fellow saboteurs. He revealed the precise locations where explosives had been buried on both Long Island and Florida. He detailed every sabotage target, every Abwehr training protocol, every code word and contact procedure. He produced a white handkerchief bearing the names of American Nazi contacts written in invisible ink. When FBI laboratory technicians exposed the handkerchief to ammonia fumes, names and addresses materialized as if by magic. Dasch was not merely confessing. He was handing over the entire German intelligence network on American soil. Armed with this wealth of information, the FBI moved with stunning speed and efficiency. On June 20th, agents arrested Ernest Berger at the Governor Clinton Hotel, finding him exactly where Dasch said he would be. Berger immediately confirmed he was, as he put it, in on the surrender, and cooperated fully. He led agents to a clothing store where he had arranged to meet Richard Quirin and Heinrich Heinck. Both were arrested on the spot, stunned to find themselves surrounded by federal agents. On June 23rd, surveillance of contacts from the invisible ink handkerchief led agents to Edward Curling in New York City. They followed him through the streets to a bar where he was meeting Werner Thiel. Both were arrested immediately, never suspecting they had been betrayed from within. On June 27th, the final 2 saboteurs, Herbert Haupt and Hermann Neubauer, were captured in Chicago. Haupt had been spectacularly indiscreet during his brief freedom, visiting his parents, seeing an ex-girlfriend, and asking his father to purchase a 1941 Pontiac for what he described as German government business. All 8 were in FBI custody, exactly 14 days after the first landing. The Bureau recovered $174,588 of the original funding. Only $612 had been spent, mostly on trains, hotels, and meals. That evening, J. Edgar Hoover held a press conference that generated front-page headlines across the country. U-boats land spies, 8 seized by FBI, the papers proclaimed. Hoover called it the detective work of the century. He praised his agents for their brilliance, their persistence, their tireless efforts to protect the American homeland. He made no mention whatsoever of George Dasch's defection. According to Hoover's carefully crafted version of events, the arrests resulted entirely from the Bureau's own investigative genius. Dasch's repeated phone calls, his journey to Washington, his $82,000 confession on an agent's desk, none of it existed in the official account. Hoover even falsified records, writing to President Roosevelt that Dasch had been apprehended in New York, rather than acknowledging that the man had voluntarily walked into FBI headquarters in Washington and handed over everything. The cover-up held for years. The truth did not emerge publicly until November 1945, when Newsweek magazine published a heavily censored version of events. As historians have since concluded, without Dasch's cooperation, the FBI would likely never have captured the saboteurs before they struck. President Franklin Roosevelt had already decided that the saboteurs would face the harshest possible punishment. He wrote to Attorney General Francis Biddle that the men were surely as guilty as it was possible to be, and that it seemed to him the death penalty was almost obligatory. He compared the case to Major John Dasch, the British spy hanged during the Revolutionary War. When advisers raised the possibility of civilian trials, Roosevelt was blunt. "I won't hand them over to any United States Marshal armed with a writ of habeas corpus," he declared. Understand? A civilian trial posed serious problems beyond Roosevelt's personal preferences. Judge Advocate General Myron Kramer warned that since no actual sabotage had been committed, no bombs detonated, no factories damaged, criminal charges would yield at most 2-year sentences for immigration violations. A public trial would also expose the embarrassing truth of Dasch's role in breaking the case and reveal how easily German submarines could reach American beaches. Neither outcome was acceptable in wartime. On July 2, 1942, Roosevelt issued Proclamation 2561, denying enemy belligerents access to civilian courts. A separate military order established a secret military tribunal and appointed its 7 members, all generals. Roosevelt simultaneously served as accuser, judge-appointer, prosecutor-selector, and final appellate authority. The concentration of power was unprecedented in American legal history. The tribunal convened on July 8, 1942, in Assembly Hall No. 1 on the 5th floor of the Department of Justice building in Washington. 7 generals presided, led by Major General Frank McCoy, a veteran of the Spanish-American War and World War I. Attorney General Francis Biddle and Judge Advocate General Myron Kramer served as prosecutors. The defense team was led by Colonel Kenneth Royall, a Harvard-trained attorney who would later become the first Secretary of the Army, and Colonel Cassius Dowell. Colonel Carl Ristine was appointed separately to represent George Dasch. In a detail that would later raise questions about conflicts of interest, Major Lowson Stone, one of the Assistant Defense Counsel, was the son of Chief Justice Harlan Fisker Stone, who would eventually rule on the constitutionality of the entire proceeding. The trial was conducted in absolute secrecy behind closed doors. On only one day, for precisely 15 minutes, were reporters allowed inside to observe. The prosecution argued that the defendants were unlawful enemy combatants who had violated the laws of war by entering American territory in civilian clothes with hostile intent. The defense countered that civilian courts were open and functioning throughout the United States, making military jurisdiction unconstitutional under the Civil War-era precedent of ex parte Milligan. Colonel Royall argued passionately that the evidence was, in his words, pathetically thin. "They did not hurt anybody," he told the tribunal. "They did not blow up anything. They did not commit a single act of sabotage." Colonel Ristine pointed out that Dasch had paid little attention to his sabotage training at Quent's Farm, had never intended to complete the mission, and had single-handedly delivered the case to the FBI when the Bureau was incapable of solving it on its own. He noted that FBI agents had promised Dasch freedom in exchange for his cooperation. The proceedings ran from July 8 through August 1, 1942. On August 3, the tribunal delivered its verdict. All 8 defendants guilty of all charges. All 8 sentenced to death by electrocution. Colonel Royall refused to accept the verdict without constitutional review. He took the extraordinary step of petitioning the Supreme Court during its summer recess, arguing that the military tribunal violated fundamental constitutional protections. After a federal district judge denied habeas corpus on the evening of July 28, the Supreme Court convened in an emergency special session on July 29, only the 3rd such session in the court's history. Arguments were heard on July 29th and 30th. On July 31st, 1942, the court issued a unanimous per curiam decision, 8-0 with Justice Frank Murphy recused. Upholding the military tribunal's jurisdiction, the defendants could be tried by military commission. Their appeal was denied. Chief Justice Harlan Fisker Stone's full written opinion would not be filed until October 29th, nearly 3 months after 6 of the petitioners were already dead. The opinion drew the crucial distinction that separated this case from the Civil War precedent. Unlike the civilian defendant in the Milligan case, these men were agents of an enemy military who had entered American territory without uniforms intending to commit hostile acts. Their status as unlawful combatants placed them outside the protections normally afforded to civilians. Even American citizenship provided no protection. Citizenship in the United States of an enemy belligerent, the court ruled, does not relieve him from the consequences of a belligerency which is unlawful because in violation of the law of war. The decision in ex parte Quirin established the legal category that would echo through American jurisprudence for decades to come, the unlawful enemy combatant. The justices were privately deeply uncomfortable with what they had done. Justice William Douglas later wrote that it was unfortunate the court had agreed to take the case at all. Justice Felix Frankfurter called it not a happy precedent. Legal scholars described the rushed opinion as a ceremonious detour to a predetermined end, written to justify a decision the court had already made. But the precedent stood. 6 decades later, in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, the Bush administration cited ex parte Quirin as the primary legal foundation for military tribunals at Guantanamo Bay. President Roosevelt reviewed and approved the death sentences on August 4, 1942. On the recommendation of Attorney General Biddle and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, he commuted 2 of the 8 sentences. George Dasch would receive 30 years in federal prison rather than death. Ernest Berger would receive life imprisonment. Their cooperation had made the case possible. More importantly, executing them would discourage future saboteurs from defecting. The other 6 would receive no mercy. On August 8, 1942, at the District of Columbia Jail, 6 men were executed by electric chair in a small room on the 3rd floor. Each execution took approximately 10 minutes. The process began at noon and was completed in just over an hour, the fastest multiple execution on record. Herbert Haupt was first, then Heinrich Heinck, then Edward Curling, then Hermann Neubauer, then Richard Quirin, finally Werner Thiel. Herbert Haupt wrote a final letter to his father the night before his death. "Try not to take this too hard," he wrote. "I have brought nothing but grief to all of my friends and relatives who did nothing wrong. My last thoughts will be of Mother." Roosevelt announced the executions the same day without explaining why Dasch and Berger had been spared. The bodies were transported to the Walter Reed Hospital morgue. 3 days later, they were buried in plain pine boxes at Potter's Field at Blue Plains in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington. No markers indicated their graves. The entire process, from landing on American beaches to execution in the electric chair, had taken less than 8 weeks. Operation Pastorius unfolded against a backdrop of extraordinary American vulnerability that is difficult to comprehend today. In June 1942, the United States had been at war for barely 6 months. The country was reeling from defeat after defeat in the Pacific. And along the Atlantic coast, a largely forgotten catastrophe was unfolding. German U-boats had launched Operation Drumbeat in January 1942, with just 5 submarines targeting the American coast. It was only the beginning. What followed became known to gleeful German submariners as the Second Happy Time. Between January and August of that year, as additional U-boats joined the campaign, Axis submarines operating in American coastal waters sank 609 ships, totaling 3.1 million tons. This represented roughly 1/4 of all Allied shipping lost to U-boats during the entire war, concentrated in just 8 months. Ships were torpedoed within sight of American beaches. Vacationers watched explosions from resort hotels. Bodies and debris washed ashore on popular swimming beaches. American coastal defenses were pathetically inadequate. Vice Admiral Adolphus Andrews, commanding the eastern sea frontier responsible for protecting the Atlantic coast, possessed 7 Coast Guard cutters, 4 converted yachts, and a handful of antique World War I patrol boats to cover hundreds of miles of shoreline. Meanwhile, 13 fleet destroyers sat idle in New York Harbor, held in reserve for other duties while merchant ships burned within sight of their moorings. Coastal cities refused to enforce blackout orders because dimming the lights would hurt tourism and make residents nervous. The first organized coastal convoy system did not begin operating until mid-May 1942, 5 months after war was declared. Operation Pastorius exposed what the U-boat campaign had already demonstrated. America's shores were dangerously porous. If 4 men with suitcases could land undetected on a Florida beach and disappear into the country within hours, what else might slip through? Fear of subversion gripped the nation. A Fortune magazine poll from 1940 found that 70% of Americans believed Germany had established a 5th column within the United States. Executive Order 9066, signed in February 1942, resulted in the forced relocation and internment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, based largely on similar fears. The FBI arrested nearly 1,400 German nationals in the months following Pearl Harbor. When Operation Pastorius was announced, it seemed to confirm the nation's worst nightmares made real, except the operation had failed completely. Not a single act of sabotage was carried out. Not a single bomb was detonated. Not a single factory was damaged. The mission collapsed, not because of brilliant counterintelligence or constant vigilance, but because the man chosen to lead it never intended to complete it in the first place. In April 1948, 6 years after the executions, President Harry Truman granted executive clemency to George Dasch and Ernest Berger, but the clemency came with an unforgiving condition: permanent deportation to the American occupation zone in Germany. Neither man was welcomed in the country of his birth. Germans viewed them as traitors whose betrayal had sent 6 fellow Germans to the electric chair. Dasch and his wife settled in a small town, but he was quickly recognized. Neighbors taunted him. He was forced to relocate repeatedly, never finding peace or acceptance. For the remaining 4 decades of his life, George Dasch campaigned obsessively to return to America. He wrote to J. Edgar Hoover, to President Eisenhower, to attorneys and congressmen, and anyone who might listen. Every request was denied. Hoover personally blocked any possibility of Dasch's return, unwilling to allow the man whose confession had made the case to undermine the official narrative of FBI brilliance. The promise Agent Traynor had made during those 8 days of interrogation, a full presidential pardon within 6 months given in the name of J. Edgar Hoover and Attorney General Francis Biddle, was never honored. The promise had been a lie from the beginning. In 1959, Dasch published his memoir, 8 Spies Against America. It was a self-serving but revealing account of a man who genuinely believed he had served his adopted country and been abandoned by it. The book found few readers and changed nothing. Dasch died on November 1, 1991, in Ludwigshafen, Germany, at the age of 88. He was still petitioning for the pardon he believed he deserved. He never received it. Ernest Berger turned against Dasch publicly after their deportation, blaming him for the deaths of the 6 executed men. Then Berger disappeared from public life entirely. He died on October 9, 1975, in his birthplace of Augsburg. Neither man ever received official recognition, acknowledgement, or gratitude from the United States government. Operation Pastorius accomplished none of its objectives. The failure enraged Adolf Hitler, who personally rebuked Admiral Canaris for the debacle. Germany never again attempted a sabotage operation against the American homeland. The only subsequent landing, Operation Elster, in November 1944, when 2 agents came ashore in Maine from U-1230, also ended in rapid capture. The legal architecture Roosevelt constructed to try and execute the saboteurs cast the longest shadow of all. Ex parte Quirin established that enemy combatants who enter American territory without uniforms to commit hostile acts may be tried by military tribunal rather than civilian court. The precedent lay dormant for nearly 60 years. Then, in the weeks following September 11, 2001, the Bush administration cited Quirin as primary justification for military commissions at Guantanamo Bay. The rushed 1942 decision, written to justify executions that had already occurred, became the foundation for a new generation of detention and military justice policy. 8 men landed on American beaches in June 1942, carrying enough explosives to wage a 2-year war against American industry. 6 died in the electric chair within 2 months. 2 lived out their remaining years as exiles, despised by the country they had betrayed and forgotten by the country they tried to save. The mission failed not because of vigilance or investigation, but because of the impossible complexities of human loyalty. George Dasch considered himself American despite his German birth. Ernest Berger had been tortured by the regime he once served, until nothing remained of his former faith. Their reasons for betraying Operation Pastorius were personal, complicated, and ultimately irrelevant to the government that used their information and then discarded them. John Cullen, the young Coast Guardsman who stumbled upon the saboteurs on that foggy Long Island beach, received the Legion of Merit for his actions. He served out the war, returned to civilian life, and rarely spoke publicly about the encounter. He died in 2011 at the age of 90. When asked about that night in June 1942, he recalled only the fog, the German words he did not understand, and the cold certainty that the men on the beach would kill him if necessary. The case itself is named for Richard Quirin, one of the 6 men executed on August 8, 1942, ex parte Quirin, not for George Dasch, the man who walked into FBI headquarters and made the case possible, not for the informant who risked everything and received nothing in return. History rarely remembers the informants. It remembers only the names attached to the legal precedents they helped create.